for the telling of the story of Utopia. And it features Thomas More himself, so he, in effect, plays himself, so to speak. He is a character in this book, doing what he actually does. He's doing ambassadorial work, right? And during this, he meets this character, Raphael. So I just wanted to ask you, did you pick up on who he is? I mean, who is this guy? Mm-hmm.
That his name was Speaker of Nonsense.
Right, Hyphlode is his last name, and that is a fanciful way of naming him that. It means speaker of nonsense or something that doesn't make sense, which kind of plays off of the title Utopia too, happy place, no place. Now, obviously, more doesn't mean that nonsense in the sense that we might use the term as in not worth our time, okay? But obviously, he's going to convey something that doesn't seem realistic to us, that doesn't seem to really match up with the real world very much. So I think he means to use that name in that sense. Okay. What else do we know about Raphael?
He's really well traveled.
Very well traveled, right? He has gone around and seen all over the world, and so he knows a lot about a lot of people, a lot of different cultures. Did somebody raise their hand? Yeah.
Traveled with America.
Right, he traveled. Right. Vespucci? Right, okay, yeah. Yes, he traveled with the famous explorer Amerigo Vespucci, right? And so, and of course, Amerigo Vespucci, that's where America gets its name, right? Just not too important to him at this time since America didn't exist, right? So, he's a sailor, but he's not just a sailor, okay? In fact, they make it really clear. Moore makes it really clear. This guy looks like a sailor, okay? Which means he's all rough and rugged. And yet, he makes a point that this person is not some guy who gets hired on to Vespucci's ship or whatever to do work. He travels, okay? He's a traveler. And he's very well read, okay? So he makes a point of telling us he's a learned man, he's educated. And in particular, he knows Greek and Latin. Why is that important, that he's educated and knows Greek and Latin and has read the classics? Yeah.
No, sorry.
Okay. Uh-huh.
That was like a language of commerce and science in the day.
Latin.
Like English today.
Mm-hmm. Latin in particular, right? In order to be an effective person, especially traveling around the world, like I would certainly be useful. Yes.
It also makes an argument for more so than when Raphael tells the story, then people know that he's not just making up nonsense. He's actually usually correct.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this is a person who has some depth, and he's educated enough, and he's a serious person. So yes, it does add some credibility. It's not like just he's a sailor who likes to tell tall tales, right? Okay, that's good. Now, Moore makes the point of saying that he knows both languages and he's read both, but that he prefers the Greek, or he has emphasized the Greek because he understands that knowledge comes from the Greeks and not from the Romans. Okay? I don't know exactly how he puts this, but this is not something that is just said by Thomas More, but is kind of universally said. I heard it in graduate school. There's no point in studying the Romans because everything they thought was derivative from the Greeks. Now, that's not entirely true, but it's true to a certain extent. They took from the Greeks, when they took over the area, their philosophy, their culture, and so forth. And a lot of the Roman authors reflect upon that learning. They derived a lot of their ideas from the Greek thinkers. So you can tell that Moore, in particular, is a fan of Greek philosophy from reading this first part. And so I suppose he wants us to know Raphael knows what he knows, okay? That he has studied Greek philosophy. He finds it to be more edifying than the Roman. And this is where his ideas come from, okay? He's in Belgium, and this is where he meets Raphael. And he meets him through Peter Giles, this friend of his, who introduces the two. And did you get the sense that Moore has particular tastes in who he will spend his time with. Yeah.
Really well-educated people.
Yeah, he's pretty particular. Several of the things that he says about this meeting leads you to believe that he doesn't spend his time with just anybody, but he assesses the people that he spends his time with as to whether they're worth it or not, whether they're worth his time. Okay? And after being introduced to him by this friend whom he already respects, and this friend tells him of his travels and of his education and so forth, then Moore's attitude is, this is somebody worthy of my time. Okay? This is somebody worthy of me listening to them. I want to spend time and have a conversation with this person. That says something about Moore's character and the way that he learned through other people, right? It may also say he's a little bit of a snob, and as we go through the part that deals with Utopia, we'll have to ask, are Moore's priorities everybody's priorities? Okay? Moore values the intellectual life very highly, probably higher than anything else. Yeah, higher than anything else. Okay? And because of that, Utopia is wrapped around that value of intellectualism and higher learning. Okay? So we see that coming out right here at the beginning. Now, as they talk, his friend Peter asks Raphael, since you know so much, and you've traveled so broadly, you know about all these cultures, and you have all this political knowledge in your head, why haven't you tried to become an ambassador or an advisor to a king? Why haven't you become more useful to those who are in power? Okay? Does anybody remember what Raphael's answer is? Anybody else? Yeah.
Doesn't he say that he doesn't want to waste his time trying to flatter the king, that he can really be listened to?
Right, that is a big part of his answer, is that he's very skeptical, he's dubious, right, as to whether such people as himself are going to be listened to anyway, because of human nature, because of the way people in power are. And he expresses that doubt. Right? Any other reasons or answers that you can think of?
He says he doesn't want to be a slave to a king.
Right, right. Now, why would such a person become a slave? What does he mean by that? Let me pop up the next slide here. Okay. That's what he says. It would be like being a slave. Can you kind of imagine yourself in this position, and in what way would it be like that? Mm-hmm.
It's where you're only asked for your information, and they don't be your advisor in court, but you're not. You're just being used for your knowledge and for your history of travel.
Yeah, to the extent that the prince wants you to be useful, right? Remember in Machiavelli's Prince, that section about advisors and how easily those around you can become a problem. Machiavelli sort of saw the other side of this coin. Princes can tyrannize over advisors, but advisors can also tyrannize over princes. They can become so influential that the prince is following their orders. And I think that Moore is open to that possibility, that an advisor can be very influential and can even direct the affairs of state through his wisdom and usefulness and so forth. So there's a play going on here, an interplay between these two views of what an advisor is, or what the worth of it is. And of course that's going on in Moore's mind, since he's the author of all this. Okay? But you've got these two perspectives. You've got Raphael on the one hand saying, I don't want to do that. Why would I want to do that? I'm my own man. I don't want to work for somebody else. I don't want to just tell them what they want to hear. He makes mention of the fact that if an advisor says something they don't want to hear, they either ignore it or they punish the messenger. There's a lot of risks involved with this, not the least of which is just the risk of being ignored, right? And then the other side of the coin is a wise person can really help a kingdom out, can really have positive, beneficial influence. and so has almost a duty to try to do that. Okay? So Peter is the one actually who asks the question and who kind of presses it. And enough time or space is given to this issue that I think it's an important one for Thomas More. Okay? What's the role of More? What's the role of somebody like More? Obviously, More decided to try to be that advisor to the king. Okay? He became a member of the king's council. He was highly respected and trusted and so forth. Probably in the back of his mind, even long before that crisis hit him, okay, that ended in his death, he was wondering, just how useful am I? Is this the way in which I can best succeed in changing things? He ran into a brick wall with King Henry. Okay? I think he thought and hoped that King Henry was an enlightened type of person who would listen to him and make changes, but he quickly found out that while he liked good conversation and he was open to ideas and wasn't very intolerant, neither was he going to change anything drastically. Perhaps More wrote this book partly because maybe he thought the book would have more of an impact than he had in that job. Okay? So I just want you to realize there's probably a lot going on there in that whole question being raised. It's raised and it's hashed out. What's the role of somebody like him supposed to be? Somebody who knows a lot, who's seen a lot, who has a lot of wisdom. In this case, Raphael. And Raphael's answer is, no way. I'm not going to do that. It wouldn't be worth my time. I'd lose my freedom, okay? And I wouldn't have that much of an impact anyway. So maybe it's better if I just continue to live my life, do my exploring, and talk to people, okay? Now then there enters into this a conversation where Raphael actually recounts a previous conversation that he's had with people on a trip to England. So if you got a little bit lost about who was talking at certain points in this introduction, don't feel bad because so do I. I have to go back and look several paragraphs up to try to remember who it is who's actually saying something. Okay? But Raphael says that he was once in England, and during that visit, he had a conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury, John Morton, who's also a cardinal, so he's referred to as the cardinal quite a bit in the introduction, in the first part here. And also a lawyer, an English lawyer. Okay? So he recounts this conversation with a man of the cloth, Archbishop of the Church of England, and a man of the law. Okay? Maybe very different types. Okay? Perhaps he chose them as representative types, the religious person and the worldly person, perhaps. Okay? And while they're having this conversation, the lawyer recounts this incident that had just happened where 20 thieves were hanged on one gibbet in a very efficient manner. And he seems to approve. Okay? So he probably said something like, the other day I saw this hanging. 20 of these thieves were hanged at once, and that's justice. But what I don't understand is, why is it that we still have so much thievery going on in London? Because if we're doing all these public executions, people can see that if you get caught stealing something, you're going to die. It's a wonder that we have any stealing going on at all. So he raises that. So you see this guy approves of the type of justice that the hanging exhibits, but at the same time he does notice it doesn't necessarily have a deterrent effect. Okay, you know what I mean by that? It doesn't necessarily mean that fewer people decide to commit the crime. Okay? But he hasn't really put those two together. You can tell that the lawyer hasn't thought of it beyond that. It's just sort of a surprise to him and an ironic thing that we still have thieves. Do you think that would discourage you? If you had any, probably would me, okay? Why wouldn't it discourage somebody back then, do you think? Yeah, in the back there.
They may have been
Bill. I mean, there's one reason why people, even if they can see there's dire consequences if you get caught, might still decide they can do it, is because it's either lose your life today or lose your life tomorrow. There's a risk of starvation, or there's some desperation that compels people. That'd be one circumstance where probably a lot of us would consider stealing something if we felt that our survival hung in the balance. Okay? Another circumstance might be simply having grown up in that type of environment where stealing is normal and accepted and to be expected. All right. So here's what Raphael says. He says, there are dreadful punishments enacted against thieves, but it were much better to make such... Well, this is Raphael, yes. Raphael is on the other side. It is much better to make such good provisions by which every man might be put in a method of how to live, and so be preserved from the fatal necessity of stealing and of dying for it. Okay? That's a quote that the video also highlighted, because in one sentence it sort of sums up Thomas More's perspective, and Raphael is the mouthpiece for that perspective. So that's his opinion, is that if we, instead of punishing people and expecting the punishment that is very dire to deter people, which it obviously doesn't do, if instead of doing that, we gave them what they needed to live. Now that's an interesting way to put it. Does he mean necessarily handouts here? If he said charity, if only Christians provided charity, we wouldn't have this level of crime. That might be a statement that you would expect to come from Thomas More, but it isn't what he's saying here. Okay? What do you think he's saying in this? What is he referring to? How would we give them this? Yeah.
They do certain work, kind of like the system sets up where they work for 6 hours a day and then they're compensated with what they need to do.
Yeah, in the Utopia, everybody works. Everybody works and everybody is provided with work. Now, in this statement, he's not leading to there yet, but he does later, right? When he's talking about what would be the ideal system be, okay? Where actually the government assures that everybody has work to do and everybody is productive. But in this, he's maybe hinting at that. But at the very least, we can say he's saying if people were put into a position where they could make a living for themselves, okay, where they could provide for themselves, then they wouldn't be in that desperate position where they had to decide whether to steal something from somebody else. Okay? It's interesting to note that the official position of the Catholic Church on this issue was actually that if a person is in dire straits and will lose their life and no one comes forth with charity, that stealing is not much of a sin when it comes right down to it because of the mitigating circumstances. The greater sin is in denying charity. Okay? So it's interesting. He doesn't use that type of formula here, but he is laying a lot of blame at the feet of people who could do something about poverty but are not. And then we put people in a position where they feel as though they have to steal in order to survive, and then we hang them when we catch them. To him that seems grossly unjust and disproportionate to the crime. Now, one thing that I wanted to highlight that you may not have completely understood the significance of appears on page 9 in a discussion of the enclosure of land. You know, Raphael starts talking about the things that the English people did that made the lives of the poor harder and made them more desperate. And this was certainly one of the biggest ones. During this period of time, animal husbandry was becoming a greater part of the economy, and the nobles who owned the land found that they could make more money off of tending or having somebody tend to sheep and other animals and using their land as graze land, right, rather than farming it. If they had stuck with farming, they would have been able to have a lot of peasants on their land. And that previous feudal system, how did a lot of people live? They lived on the noble's land. They were given a certain amount of land to farm. I had to give up quite a bit of what they produced to the noble to pay for being there and for the protection of the noble, but they also got to keep some of it for their own use and even in some cases to sell it. Okay? So it gave people a livelihood. Karl Marx is going to look back at that and this, in his view, another system of exploitation, and it probably was. But at least it kept people who were allowed to do that from entire desperate straits. Okay? But as they began to put fences around pastures and make this into pasture land, with total disregard for the people who had been living on there because it wasn't their property, okay? They were just tenants. Okay? They threw those people out without any notion of what they would do and without any particular concern. So he describes this on near the top of page 9. He says, "But I do not think that this necessity of stealing arises only from hence. There is another cause of it, more particular to England." "What is that?" said the Cardinal. "The increase of pasture," said I, which is Raphael, "by which your sheep, which are naturally mild and easily kept under control, may be said now to devour men, the unpeopled, not only villages but towns. For wherever it is found that the sheep of any soil yield a softer and richer wool than the ordinary, there the nobility and gentry, and even those holy men, the abbots, not contented with the old rents which their farms yielded, nor thinking it enough that they, living at their ease, do no good to the public, resolve to do it hurt instead of good. They stop the course of agriculture, destroying houses and towns, reserving only the churches, and enclose the grounds that they may lodge their sheep in them. As if forests and parks had swallowed up too little of the land. And that's a reference to their need for hunting ground. They already had enclosed or made off limits quite a bit of the forest so that they could do their hunting. Okay? If you've ever read Robin Hood, you kind of know what is going on here, I guess, because this was the time that these were the types of actions in which that sort of led to that response of, you're throwing people off, you're abusing people, there's people who can't live because they have nowhere to be able to make a living. For when an insatiable wretch who is a plague to his country resolves to enclose many thousands of acres of ground, the owners as well as tenants are turned out of their possessions by tricks or by main force, or being wearied out with ill usage, they are forced to sell them, by which means those miserable people, both men and women, married and unmarried, old and young, with their poor but numerous families, are all forced to change their seats, not knowing whither to go, and they must sell almost nothing of their household stuff, which could not bring them much money, even though they might stay for a buyer. When that little money is at an end, for it will soon be spent, what is left for them to do but either to steal or so be hanged, God knows how justly, or to go about and beg. So I gather from this that More thought that the enclosure of land was a huge problem, that he could see the effects of this change in the economy, we might say now, the effects that had on a great number of people who really lived from hand to mouth to begin with. And once this land is taken away from them, they cannot make their livelihood that way. They literally have nothing. So what do? They go to a big city to see if they can find some way to live there amongst many other people. They find that there's nothing, there's not enough for them there, so then they enter into crime or prostitution to try to make some money. Okay? Well, this may be an obvious question in a way, but what kind of attitude does that policy of enclosure, that the fact that these landowners just threw these people out, okay, and enclosed the land so that they could make more money with sheep, what kind of attitude does that convey towards the poor? Right? There's a total disregard for them. They don't mean anything to these people, right? Now, sometimes I think we think that we're way better than people then, right? And now we understand that people mean something. But I dare say that probably one of the first things that would leap into our minds today is we know what the consequences to ourselves would be of enacting this type of policy. We do understand that better, okay? We would think, well, we're going to have more crime. What are we going to do? Okay, we're going to have people living on the streets. That's going to cost us because we feel as though we have some obligation, not just moral, but in in the way of self-interest to try to eliminate those kind of social problems. And so we would almost turn to a cost-benefit analysis. Okay? I think we would probably be able to see the consequences of throwing this many people off of their livelihood all at once. Okay? Because we understand, at the very least, that people are interconnected to a certain degree. What affects a large majority of people is going to come back on us. And that's exactly what happened here. But they did not think that way. Okay? There was no thinking about what is the larger societal or economic consequences. There was only, I want to make more money, this is my land, I'm going to put a fence around it. Okay? So the overall consequences more is beginning to see. And think about it, not just in terms of what is the moral impact of this, but what is the practical impact of it. Okay? Now you've got cities crowded with people who can't earn a living and who are committing lots and lots of crime. Okay? This was something that could have been prevented, see, with some planning and some foresight. And this is the kind of insight that the humanists had, and more in particular is trying to develop here, that, hey, we do some pretty stupid things that we ought to know are going to have consequences for them and for us, but we do them anyway. We need to start thinking about and planning and realizing that every step that we take has an impact, has a ripple effect. Okay? So it seems like kind of a no-brainer to us, I suppose, to think about the societal and economic consequences, for instance, of throwing everybody out of factory work, right? Not because the economy is poor, but because we've decided all of a sudden we're just not going to do that anymore. We're going to make money someplace else. To a certain extent, our economy has done that gradually itself. But here we have individuals deciding to do it in a relatively short period of time with no sort of planning or any sort of safety net, you might say, in order to deal with the problems that cause. Okay? There's another thing that he mentions here which might bear a little bit of discussion too. Right after that, he talks about another problem that the English have, and I'm sure the English were not alone at all. I know they weren't, but another problem that he points out is this problem of luxury. And that's an issue that he deals with a lot in Utopia itself. Okay? Raphael points it out, but it's More's thought, right? He says on the middle of page 10, luxury likewise breaks in apace upon you to set forward your poverty and misery. There is an excessive vanity in apparel and great cost in diet, and that not only in noblemen's families, but even amongst tradesmen, among farmers themselves, among all ranks of persons. You have also many infamous houses, and besides those that are known, the taverns and ale houses are no better. Add to these dice, cards, tables, football, tennis, and quoits, whatever that is, in which money runs fast away, so gambling. And those that are initiated into them must, in the conclusion, betake themselves to robbing for a supply. Well, let me stop there and ask, what's the connection between spending too much money on clothing and food, which probably the rich in particular could be said to do, and spending a lot of money on gambling? What's the connection there?
Wasteful spending.
It's all waste. It's all waste, right? So he's not looking at any particular part of society. He's showing that he's an equal opportunity blamer here, okay? Those who would gamble away what they have are likely going to be of the lower classes of people who only have so much. And then he says, when they do lose their money, then they take themselves to robbing to get a fresh supply of money. Okay, so he's noticed this behavior. But to him, it's all waste. All this money that's being spent on gambling, which gives us nothing in return, okay, on clothing and on food and on entertainment, which gives us nothing, in his view, of value in return, okay? And he says, banish those plagues and give orders that those who have dispelled so much soil may either rebuild their villages they've pulled down or let out their grounds to such as will do it. Restrain those engrossing of the rich. that are as bad almost as monopolies. There's another reference to enclosure. In fact, what he's saying is a lot of the money that people have made off of enclosure and of making more money from the land in this way, those people have used it just to waste it. Okay? So you've got this concentration of profit, okay, of money in the hands of these people, and that represents value that could be used, in his view, to benefit a much larger group of people. Okay? But instead, it's concentrated into the hands of a few people, and it's being used to benefit them. And he doesn't even think they're receiving much of a benefit because they're not spending it on anything that actually improves. It's as though it disappears. You know, if you buy yourself a nice feast, you eat the feast, it's gone. You don't have anything left. You don't have anything that you can build with or do anything creative with in the future. If you buy some clothes, they're pretty, but, you know, there's really nothing there of value that helps you or anybody else do something more. Okay? So he really has a problem with waste and inefficiency. And he really seems to think if we could take away, if we could remove this excessive spending on things we don't need, and if we could make everybody productive, everybody works, everybody's got a job, we will have enough for everyone to live at a decent level. Okay? Instead of having these few people up here who live lives of luxury and these many people down here who are barely making ends meet and trying to survive. Okay? Now, I'm not saying necessarily that he's got the answers here. I'm telling you what his view is. And of course, if you think this way, if you see the world this way, then I'm sure you can see why a person would jump to, we need to plan the economy. People aren't making rational decisions, economic decisions. So we need to jump in with, smart people need to plan the economy. All right? Now, interestingly, in this first part, God, and by God I mean the Judeo-Christian God, is mentioned numerous times because Raphael brings God up into the conversation as in God would want us to do this. Okay? So he does inject that aspect that you would find, I guess, more understandable or more likely to come from Thomas More at this point. Okay? Where the message is, I know what God says. And he even says that Raphael tells the cardinal what God would want several times through several different means. And at some points even seems a little bit preachy, like when he talks about Mosaic law and about how the Jews applied Mosaic law, and shouldn't we Christians who have a more view of a loving God, shouldn't we be even more charitable than the Jews, et cetera, et cetera. And this is a quote that kind of sums up the comment, or what he aims at the cardinal. God has commanded us not to kill, which is, of course, a reference to the commandment, okay, not to kill. And shall we kill so easily for so little money? Okay, which is a reference to the stealing. If a guy goes and steals a pickpocket, steals some other person's wallet and makes $10, and we kill him, is that disproportionate? Yes, it is in his view. So, especially considering this commandment not to kill.
Was Moore anti-Semite?
Not that I know of, but identifying an anti-Semite at this time would take a little bit of doing, because almost all Christians very consciously thought that the Christian religion was superior to the Jewish, and had conceptions of Jews that you might think were anti-Semitic now. So, quite possibly, from our perspective in particular, he was. One of the things he says makes me think he could have done worse. Some of the things that he says when he brings up Jews, he refrains from making a direct, insulting statement. The worst that he does is he compares Christians to Jews as Christians are more milder because we have this new revelation, the implication being that now we know God better than they do. Well, that's something that every Christian thought, and many still do. But many, many people at this time were absolutely anti-Semitic, so it wouldn't be a surprise to me if Moore and everybody around him had certain ideas about Jews that were, such as being greedy, practicing usury, which is sinful, et cetera, et cetera. These were the times in which anti-Semitism was born, and then grew and grew and grew in Europe. So it's a good question. Okay. But he refrains. I've seen thinkers do a lot worse than Thomas More does in taking shots at Jews. Okay. Well, we're almost out of time, but here's the last question I wanted you to think about. Why do you think More doesn't have these words coming out of the Archbishop's mouth? Why does he have Raphael preaching to the Archbishop? Now, I should say in advance, the Archbishop is not depicted as somebody who loves injustice and favors hanging people and so forth. But he ends up agreeing with some of the things that Raphael says. So he's not the boogeyman here. But why do you think that the Archbishop isn't saying God doesn't like these things?
Well, is it because at this point has community succeeded without it being some church?
Not quite. Not quite. Okay? It's something to think about. I think we'll come back to this next time. Okay?